In 1947, a Norwegian trapper named Axel Halvorsen walked into the forests north of Tromsø and never came back the same man. When they found him 3 weeks later, 40 miles from where he'd vanished, he was sitting cross-legged in the snow, facing a direction that led to nothing. No town, no trail, no landmark. His compass was destroyed. Not broken. Melted. And the only thing he said over and over for the rest of his life was this: I found the edge. And something found me first. Beat. Music swells, low strings tense. Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years, has told the same story. A place where the known world simply stops. Where the map runs out of ink. Where the sun doesn't behave the way it should. Where shadows move without a source, and where something, or someone, has been waiting on the other side. They called it many things. The Shadowlands, the Umbrella, the Dreaming's Edge, the farthest country. Tonight we're going there. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at an empty tree line the same way again. Make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to tell you gets stranger with every chapter. Let's begin. Long before satellites mapped every inch of this planet, humans already knew, or believed they knew, that the world had a boundary. Not a political border. Not an ocean's horizon. A real boundary, where the rules of reality thinned out like fabric worn down to its last threads. The ancient Greeks called the edges of their known world the land of the Cimmerians, a place shrouded in permanent mist, where the sun never fully rose. Homer wrote that no light ever reached them, not because of clouds, but because of something deeper, something that swallowed daylight whole. The Norse had Niflheim, a realm of primordial fog at the edge of the 9 worlds, tangled in ice and shadow, home to things that existed before gods. In West Africa, the Yoruba spoke of a boundary layer between the realm of the living and Orin, the spirit world, thin in certain forests, thin at certain hours, thin enough that if you walked too far at twilight, you might not walk back into the world you left. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia describe something even stranger. Not a place at the edge of geography, but at the edge of time itself, the dreaming, a layer of reality running parallel to ours, where ancestral beings still move, still watch, still occasionally cross over. And in medieval Europe, when cartographers reached the limits of what they'd explored, they didn't just leave the parchment blank. They wrote 3 words that have haunted historians for centuries. Here be dragons. Pause for effect. Now, most historians will tell you that phrase was just a decorative flourish, a way of marking unexplored territory. And maybe that's all it was. But here's the question that should be bothering you right now. Why did every single culture, with no contact with one another, separated by continents and millennia, describe the same thing? A place at the edge. A thinning of light. A boundary that shouldn't be crossed. Coincidence doesn't usually look that consistent. Let's talk about something concrete for a moment, because I know some of you are thinking, okay, but this is just mythology. Fair. So let's look at the paper trail. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis created a map so precise that modern cartographers are still arguing about how he made it. It correctly shows the coastline of South America, and this is the part that gets debated. A landmass that some researchers claim resembles the coast of Antarctica, centuries before it was, officially, discovered, and even more strangely, showing it without the ice sheet that has covered it for millions of years. The mainstream explanation is that Piri Reis compiled older, lost source maps, possibly Phoenician or ancient Greek in origin, and that the Antarctic coastline is actually a distorted rendering of South America's tip. That's the reasonable, well-supported answer, and it's important to say so. But sailors of that era weren't just drawing coastlines. Look closely at 15th and 16th century nautical charts, and in the blank regions, the unmapped waters, you'll find recurring symbols. Spirals. Concentric rings. Shapes that don't correspond to any known geographic feature. Some historians call them decorative. Others have noted that these exact symbols appear, independently, in indigenous oral maps from the Pacific Islands, used to mark places where the water forgets which way is home. Polynesian navigators, some of the greatest wayfinders in human history, who could cross thousands of miles of open ocean using stars, swells, and birds, they had names for these zones too. Regions where their instincts, honed over 1,000 generations, simply stopped working. Where the swells moved in patterns that matched nothing. They didn't sail through them. They sailed around them. And if you think this is purely a pre-modern phenomenon, a problem solved by GPS and satellite imaging, I need you to stay with me, because Chapter 3 is where this gets a lot less comfortable. Let's fast forward to a case file that most true crime and mystery channels have touched on, but never from the angle we're about to take. December 1978. Frederick Valentik. A 20-year-old pilot took off from Melbourne, Australia, on a routine training flight across the Bass Strait. Air traffic control received a series of increasingly bizarre transmissions. Valentik reported an unidentified aircraft flying above him, doing maneuvers his own plane couldn't replicate. His final transmission was a burst of unexplained metallic noise. Then nothing. No wreckage. No debris field. No body. To this day, the case remains officially open. The UFO angle got all the headlines. But there's a detail that gets left out of nearly every retelling. Valentik's last coherent words, moments before the static, were, "It's not an aircraft." Not, "It's a UFO." Not, "It's an alien ship." It's not an aircraft. As if he was trying, in his final seconds, to describe something his vocabulary had no category for. Now compare that to 1971, Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19, the famous disappearance of 5 Navy bombers. The lead pilot's final radio transmissions described the ocean itself looking wrong. Everything looked strange, even the ocean. Compasses spinning. White water that wasn't white water. A description that, if you strip away 70 years of pop culture Bermuda Triangle mythology, sounds an awful lot like Axel Halvorsson's melted compass in the Norwegian snow. Then there's a case far less famous, but arguably far stranger, the Kinross incident, November 1953. An Air Force jet, piloted by Felix Moncla, was scrambled to intercept an unidentified radar contact over Lake Superior. Ground radar watched the two blips converge into a single blip. And then that single blip simply vanished. No debris was ever recovered from the lake despite extensive searches. The U.S. Air Force's official file lists the cause as unknown. 3 different decades. 3 different continents. 3 different vehicles, a plane, a squadron, a jet. All converging on the same 3 details. 1. Instruments failing or behaving impossibly. 2. A final transmission describing something the observer had no words for. 3. A disappearance so complete that even debris, the most basic evidence of physical destruction, never surfaced. Beat. If you're new here, this is usually the point where I remind you, I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm asking you to notice the pattern. And the pattern is what we're chasing for the rest of this video. Let's go back to solid ground, literally, because some of the strangest reports of the edge don't come from oceans or skies. They come from forests. In Romania, There's a region locals have nicknamed the Hoia-Baciu Forest, and it has a reputation that predates modern ghost hunting culture by centuries. Shepherds in the 1600s reported flocks of sheep entering the tree line and never coming out. In the 20th century, a biologist named Alexandru Sif claimed to have taken photographs inside the forest that, when developed, showed a circular clearing where compasses and cameras malfunctioned, batteries draining in minutes, straight lines curving on film. Skeptics point out, correctly, that Hoia-Baciu sits on a geologically active area with unusual magnetic properties, which could explain instrument malfunction without needing anything paranormal. That's a legitimate, evidence-based explanation, and it's worth taking seriously. But here's what doesn't fit that explanation quite as neatly: the recurring testimony, across dozens of unrelated hikers over decades, describing the same specific sensation, the feeling of being herded. Not lost. Not disoriented in a random way. Guided, gently, consistently, toward a particular clearing, as though the forest itself had a preferred destination in mind for them. Compare this to reports from the Aokigahara forest in Japan, at the base of Mount Fuji, a place with its own tragic and very real human history, which deserves to be treated with care rather than sensationalism. But long before it carried the reputation it has today, local Japanese folklore already described this forest as a boundary space. A place where eerie, spirits caught between worlds, were said to gather, because the dense volcanic rock disrupted the natural order of the land enough that the wall between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. Again, a physical explanation exists. Volcanic rock genuinely does disrupt compass readings in Aokigahara. This is measurable, real, and well documented by geologists. But the cultural memory of the place as a thin spot predates any scientific understanding of magnetism. The folklore got there first. So we're left with an uncomfortable question: are these physical anomalies, magnetic fields, geological quirks, the entire explanation? Or are they simply the measurable symptoms of something these cultures were describing in the only language available to them? Now I want to introduce you to a name most of you have never heard, because his career ended quietly, and not by his own choice. Dr. Elias Marchetti, a geophysicist affiliated with a research consortium in the 1980s, spent nearly a decade studying what he called boundary zones, regions where multiple, independent anomalies clustered together. Magnetic disturbance, unexplained radio interference, disproportionate numbers of missing persons cases, and consistent local folklore describing the area as a threshold of some kind. Marchetti's hypothesis, published in a handful of obscure geophysics journals before his funding dried up, was cautious and deliberately unsensational. He proposed that certain locations on Earth may experience rare, localized disruptions in the consistency of the electromagnetic field. Not portals, not other dimensions, nothing that dramatic. Just measurable inconsistencies that, combined with human psychology's tendency to seek narrative explanations for the unexplainable, could account for centuries of edge of the world folklore. It's a sober, defensible theory. It's also, notably, not the theory that ended his career. What ended his career was a private research memo, leaked years later and never fully authenticated, so treat this with real skepticism. Describing a 1986 expedition to one of these boundary zones in a remote part of Siberia. According to the memo, of the 6-person survey team, 5 returned. The 6 team members' disappearance was attributed, in the official report, to exposure and disorientation. But the leaked memo allegedly contains a separate, unofficial note from Marchetti, written days after returning. Again, unauthenticated, so take this as folklore layered onto folklore, not established fact. The note reportedly says, We did not lose him to the cold. We lost him to the direction we were not supposed to look. Long pause. I want to be very clear with you here. I cannot verify that memo. Neither can most researchers who've chased this story. It may be an embellishment, a hoax, or a genuine account of a tragedy dressed in poetic language by a grieving colleague. I'm giving it to you with every caveat attached, because that's what responsible storytelling requires. But it's also exactly the kind of account that keeps showing up, again and again, whenever someone gets close enough to the edge to look back and tell us what they saw. So let's ask the question you've been waiting for. If these boundary places are real, geologically, psychologically, or otherwise, what, according to the testimony across cultures and centuries, is actually said to live there? The answers are strangely consistent. First, the Watchers. Nearly every tradition describing an edge also describes a presence that observes without approaching. The Norse spoke of eyes in the Niflheim mist. Siberian shamanic traditions describe the ones who stand at the tree line and do not blink. Modern accounts, hikers, campers, hunters, describe an identical sensation, the unmistakable, skin-crawling certainty of being watched from just beyond the range of vision, in forests where no animal should logically be large enough to produce that feeling. Second, the mimics. This is the detail that shows up with the most disturbing consistency across totally unrelated cultures. A being, or beings, capable of producing sound, specifically the sound of a human voice, often a familiar one, often calling your name, from a location where no human could possibly be. Aboriginal Australian traditions warn against answering when you hear your name called in the bush at night, because the thing that calls is never the one who loves you. Appalachian folklore in the United States contains an almost word-for-word warning. Don't answer a voice calling from the woods unless you've heard it call twice, because the story goes that whatever's out there only needs to imitate a voice once to lure you, but it can only manage the imitation correctly the second time if it's already gotten a good enough look at you the first. Third, the doorkeepers. Described far less often, and always with more reverence than fear. Being said not to threaten those who reach the edge, but to guard it. Sometimes actively turning travelers back the way they came, sometimes simply appearing as a final, wordless warning before a person turns around on their own. Halvorsen, the Norwegian trapper from our cold open, described something matching this pattern in the fragments of testimony he gave before his death. A tall, still shape, unmoving, positioned exactly between him and the direction he'd been walking. He said it didn't attack him. It didn't speak. It simply stood there until he understood, and turned back. Now, I want to pause here and give you the skeptical read, because it matters. Human pattern recognition is extraordinarily good at finding faces and figures in ambiguous visual noise. It's called pareidolia, and it's a well-documented cognitive phenomenon. Sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and extreme isolation, all common conditions for people who report these encounters, are also well documented to produce hallucinations, including auditory hallucinations of familiar voices. There is a complete, scientifically grounded explanation available for nearly every individual case we've covered tonight. What science has a harder time explaining is the hallucination is always the same one. Here's where I want to bring everything together, because I think there's a deeper thread running through all of this that most videos on this topic miss entirely. Every single boundary, the Norse Niflheim, the Aboriginal Dreaming's Edge, the Yoruba threshold to Oran, the medieval Here Be Dragons, the Bermuda Triangle, Hoiabachu, Aokigahara, Marchetti's Siberian boundary zone, shares three identical structural features, regardless of the culture or century that produced it. 1. The boundary is never fixed. It moves, or its exact location is disputed, or it can only be found by accident and never by deliberate searching. 2. Those who cross it and return are irrevocably changed, not injured, not traumatized in the conventional sense, but altered, as though something about their relationship to reality has been permanently recalibrated. Halvorsen spent the rest of his life facing that same impossible direction. Marchetti, if the leaked memo is genuine, apparently spent his final working years quietly trying to warn people away from the very research he'd once pursued. 3. The boundary always seems to want something specific. Not everyone who approaches it disappears. Most don't. But something, in nearly every account, seems to be selecting. Anthropologists who study these convergent myths. Real, credentialed anthropologists, not fringe theorists, have a term for this kind of pattern. They call it a cross-cultural attractor, an idea so structurally compelling to the human mind that it reemerges independently, again and again, even across populations with zero historical contact. The mainstream explanation is that this attractor exists because it's psychologically useful. It teaches caution, it explains disappearances, which happen in every era, for mundane reasons like exposure, drowning, and getting lost, and it gives communities a shared vocabulary for the terror of the unknown. That's a completely reasonable, well-supported explanation. But it doesn't fully explain the compass. It doesn't explain Valentika's last words. It doesn't explain why sailors who never read Norse mythology describe the exact same feeling of a boundary in the open Pacific that Icelandic sagas described in frozen fjords 800 years earlier. So let's say, hypothetically, that some version of this is real. Not aliens, not literal dragons, not a fantasy realm, just some poorly understood, rare phenomenon at the boundary of geography, geology, and human perception, powerful enough to have left the same fingerprint on every culture that's ever brushed against it. What do the stories agree you should do, if you ever find yourself standing at that edge? The advice, again, is strangely consistent. Don't answer a voice you can't place a body to. Don't trust a compass that behaves differently than it did an hour ago. Trust your own last known position instead. If you feel watched and see nothing, don't run. Every culture, without exception, warns that running is what invites pursuit. Walking back, slowly, deliberately, the way you came, is the only method that consistently appears in the stories of people who made it home. And if something stands between you and the direction you intended to go, Halvorsen's silent figure, the Aboriginal Dreaming's guardians, the doorkeepers, of a dozen unrelated traditions, take it as an answer, not an obstacle. Whether you believe any of this reflects something genuinely uncanny about the natural world, or whether you believe it's simply the most elegant horror story our species ever collectively wrote. One passed hand to hand, culture to culture, without any of us ever fully agreeing to write it. The practical advice holds up either way. It's just good wilderness safety wearing a folklore costume. We began this video with Axel Halvorsen, sitting in the snow, facing a direction that led to nothing. He lived another 31 years after that day. Neighbors said he never fully explained what he saw. But every winter, on the anniversary of the day he walked out of that forest, he'd stand at the edge of his property line, at dusk, facing that same direction. Just for a few minutes. Then he'd go back inside. Nobody ever asked him what he was doing. Somehow, everyone who knew him understood not to. Maybe the Shadowlands are nothing more than the oldest story we've ever told ourselves. A way of putting a shape to the parts of the world we haven't mapped, and the parts of the dark we haven't explained. Or maybe, every few centuries, in a handful of scattered, forgotten places, something genuinely thin separates us from whatever's on the other side. Either way, the next time you're standing at a tree line at dusk, and you feel that unmistakable sensation of being watched from just beyond where you can see. I'd trust it. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. If this video gave you chills even once, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which chapter got to you the most, and let me know, should we go looking for the next Shadowland? Because I already have a case file open.